Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today we're doing an update with Lasha Kasradze, a liaison officer of Sokhumi State University, residing in the United States. Lasha, welcome back.
Thank you, Pascal. It's great to be back.
Lasha, we're seeing right now a couple of things in world politics that I would like to discuss with you. We said let's discuss it as maybe what we could call the end of the myth, or the myths that are being dispelled right now in front of our eyes when it comes to IR and how the world works. What do you think, to you, what's the biggest myth that's being busted right now and that's going to be impossible to put back together again?
Thanks for that, Pascal. Yes. Well, first, let's just say that let's just establish that the myth has been deconstructed, so to speak. The post-Cold War myth within the non-Western world, global South, BRICS, I think it would be fair to say has been called and has been deconstructed.
So you mean the myth that there was a post-Cold War, or the myth of the liberal international order?
Well, right. So that's correct. The post-Cold War liberal institutionalism, liberal hegemony, eh, democracy promotion, with its apex that it reached during the Bush administration, all that I think has been rediscovered as nothing but basically nothing but hot air, fluff, to a large extent. There are some good elements in it. Perhaps intention was good. But I think that it's been revealed that ideology, neoconservatism, and practitioners of that worldview have hijacked those good ideas and turned them into some grotesque, ideologically driven foreign policy that has arrived to the very present day of absurdity that we are witnessing, that we are seeing being translated, say, in Brussels, for example. Not to mention Washington, of course. It's I would say, as its originator, but we are seeing sort of these comical events taking place where they're just basically falling upon their own absurdity, driven by ideology, complete loss of common sense and rationality. And it's a very sad situation to witness. And not to mention, well, what makes it sad is that, look, the world has witnessed ideologically driven massacres. The European continent has gone through 2 world wars, but not in peacetime, not when all of that was supposed to be over. That's the problem. That's the tragedy of this thing.
Yeah, and you're calling it comical, but it's comical without being funny, right? It's
Right.
just
Yeah.
the charade, and a charade that is to some extent there to entertain us and to keep the masses quiet, but on the other hand also to kind of uphold an image that 30 years ago would still have been believable, and today it's not. We're just reading, that the BBC right now is under big pressure because a lie has been debunked. And I read through that and I thought, like, oh wow, are they talking about the lie of the lie about Gaza, the lies about Ukraine? No, it's apparently the lie that they cut together a video about Donald Trump in a way that he never actually said things on January 6th back in 2020. And I'm like, okay, so that's the lies that are being called. The lies that are being called are the lies about other liars within the same system. That's again, it blows my mind of what kind of things that currently go as, deconstructing the narrative. And I wonder to myself whether we are not again like caught within a narrative bubble in the West, just shifting to the next narrative bubble from liberal international order to the Trump bubble, but the West still being caught within its own little mindset. What do you make out of that?
I think, by the way, I flittingly heard about that story. I think top brass of BBC resigned.
Yeah, two executives apparently were chopped.
Yeah,
Over reporting on Trump, not on Gaza, not on Ukraine, not on Venezuela, on nothing else on Mr. Trump. It's quite
we just cannot fathom the idea that there is somebody in Washington who actually challenges the system. Just can't, they cannot accept it. Unless it's their uniform way of looking at the world, of waving their fingers at everybody else, of telling them how to be democratic or better peoples, better societies. They're just not going to tolerate anything other than that. So your last question.
My last point is like, are we witnessing kind of a, the new myths, the new way in which the West will keep itself busy with itself, ignoring the actual shifts that are going on? I mean, let's look at Georgia, where you're from. I mean, Georgia has gone through a very intense learning period in terms of what the West is about, right? Of starting basically off as something like a small Ukraine and having a proxy war with Russia, all the way to learning how to say no without actually saying like we're going to join the Russians. It's like Georgia had to go through a moment of like very intense not soul searching, but approach searching, right? Of how to deal with the fact that you cannot trust the West, while you obviously also don't want to throw yourself into anyone or in any other country's camp. How do you think that these countries right now are trying to navigate, or at least those who have been exposed to these challenges?
Yeah, it's a great epiphany, if you will. It was a great realization within Georgia that happened. Just very briefly to your original point, will the West ever realize what's happening, what it's done, or will it collapse on its own mythology creation and lying to itself first and foremost? And I think if they continue, I think, first of all, they're facing a huge embarrassment. Donald Trump, the man tries, he's surrounded by traditional sort of demagoguery in Washington. One could argue that he has to push back more strongly. That's a different sort of a discussion altogether. But, he has tried, Israel, Palestine, or Russia, Ukraine. But you see now how he's being dragged all over, even in the Western Hemisphere, in the U.S. neighborhood, vis-a-vis Venezuela. So yeah, again, to answer your question, I think the West is sort of going to continue to slip up on its own madness, if you will, until it realizes that there is no other way but to face the reality. What happens now concerning Georgia, as far as Georgia is concerned, Georgia, ironically, I know John Mearsheimer puts his finger on 2017 as sort of the beginning of the end, or the end of the unipolar moment, unipolar world. And not that I'm correcting Professor Mearsheimer, but I'm saying, I would argue that also Georgia sort of realized this back in 2008. After 2008, when Russia came invaded Georgia and almost ended that state's Georgia's national, nationhood and the statehood. If Putin had taken Tbilisi, I keep saying this, Georgia as we know it today would not have existed, or would not exist. So shortly, well, it was 2008. So in 2012, so it took about 3 to 5 years, but then slowly started to come out of this fantasy world. And with the coming to power of the Georgian dream, they started to realize that something was fundamentally wrong, and it was just not sustainable any longer. Business as usual, meaning listening to the sort of Tory Newlands of the world, John McCain's of the world, being egged on against Russia, all in this sort of very cynical, if you think about it, very condescending. You go fight. We're here with you. The whole phrase of freedom is not free has been used countless times in Georgia, sort of to show them that, hey, look, people die for freedom, and so it was a going back to the original point, our opening statements. It was a myth. It was a creation, manufacturing of myths, of narratives that brave sort of Washington establishment stands with Georgia, this small country, against this evil Russia, and this extreme sort of normative, values-based, quote unquote values-based, because people who were preaching values and democracy couldn't care less if they actually, if those values had actually or could have been consolidated in Georgia, and the only now we know the only motivating factor behind all that was to see if they could weaken Russia by egging Georgia against Moscow. Obviously, right from the get-go, that was a foolish strategy. It never would have worked. It has been tried throughout centuries. It was tried a few years leading up to the Russian Revolution, after the Russian Revolution, from Great Britain, from its traditional sort of fear of Russia taking over, Great Britain's most praised possession, India, that whole brouhaha with Afghanistan and the turn it to a great game. That Great Britain tried to prop up the then sort of declining Ottoman Empire, eventually leading to the Crimean War. All this was all sort of perhaps not exactly uniform, but overall strategic calculus of the West was always to create some sort of strategic vulnerability around the periphery of the Imperial Russia, the Soviet Russia, and it didn't work. Zbigniew Brzezinski's grand vision to destroy Russia, perhaps the destruction is destroying Russia is sort of a simplistic term, but to weaken Russia turned out to be a failure as well. His propping up of Afghanistan, for example, his understanding, he understood correctly that Eurasia was the place to be if the West, collective West, and particularly the United States, were to maintain its primacy, but it just didn't work. Russia did not disappear. Russia remains to be a major nuclear power, the only country on the planet that can devastate the continental United States if it came to a nuclear exchange. And the rest, the rest is just noise. The rest is what we said in the beginning of this recording, which is that myth creation. They had to justify. Undoubtedly, the collective West defeated the Soviet Union. And it did so because of, let's be honest, there were some good, better ideas, okay? Not that capitalism or communism, however they looked on paper. The fact of the matter is, materially and in practice, the West won. Their ideas sort of triumphed. But then things went downhill. America, in my view, just blew it in terms of maintenance of that enormous legitimacy after the collapse, after the victory in the Cold War. Now, this is not. Now we can go back to World War II and talk about go back to Stalin, if you will, go back to Lavrenti Beria, if you will, how they were extremely strategic with Roosevelt, who was, in my view, a genius of a president that the United States, one of the greatest presidents that the United States has ever had. How these two were keen on maintaining and understood that the Soviet Union could not have maintained its parity with the United States and the collective West, because at the end of the day, even I'm not advocating for Stalin here or defending him, but what I'm saying is the man had a strategic vision, and he's considered to be one of the greatest politicians that has ever lived. He understood that Soviet Union had to build bridges with Washington rather than destroy bridges. And it was understood right after the Cold War. Beria understood this. Lavrenti Beria understood this. And Roosevelt understood this. And then comes, the very simple man called Harry Truman. He was probably the first neocon, would you say, after the World War II, where he just hated communism, and in his simplistic terminology and worldview starts to, cry, Red Russia, and sets in this panic, and all hell breaks loose from there, if you will. In other words, that whole strategic game where these two giants could have gotten along economically, politically, that went out the window. So
I just need to underscore that point, because a lot of people take it for granted that the Cold War had to become the Cold War because it was obvious that capitalism, communism. No, it was not. The best example that it was not obvious is that in 1944, the famous Bretton Woods conference that restructured the post-war economy. You know who was present there? The Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. There's this beautiful picture of John Maynard Keynes talking with his colleagues from Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, right? And the idea in 44 was to create a post-world structure, an economic structure that would include everybody. So it wasn't clear at all that this was the obvious next thing to come. It was actually rather a shock once it became clear in 47, but certainly 48 then, that there was this next big confrontation that would emerge. And actually the ones who worked or had proposals to avert it was the Soviet Union, who proposed a reunified neutral Germany back in 52, 53, the Stalin notes. And I have good colleagues from Austria who are saying like, but it was all a charade. They never meant it because we don't have any documents that would prove that they prepared for that. But then we have other people who wrote like a 1,300-page book in German by Michael Gayler, who wrote very convincingly, no, they believed in it. I mean, this was a strategy, one among others, one that in the end couldn't win out because the people who want to build bridges were the ones who lost to those who said we need a wall. And the wall idea finally won, although we have porous parts, right? We had parts in Europe where the bridge building worked, one of them being, of course, Austria, which then in 1955 was successfully neutralized and until today lived happily and prosperously and so on. We had neutralized Finland, basically, that managed to be both part of the West while a security guarantor to the Soviet Union. So we had these parts of Europe, but the big clashing point, Germany, became a wall instead of a bridge. And this is also one of these myth makings, right? This make-believe that these systems always had to clash. No, that was not a given.
No, there was no necessity behind it. Correct. There was no determinism, the deterministic sort of environment that would suggest that no, this is the way it was supposed to be. Germany's neutrality requirement out of Kremlin back then was just why can't we compare that to what Putin was asking for Ukraine?
We should compare it. I mean, it's very, very similar, actually. And let's not forget, until this day, and we're recording this on the 11th of November, 2025, the Russians are still demanding the neutrality of Ukraine because they're saying it cannot be part of NATO. It can do whatever it wants. It can just not be our enemy. It doesn't need to be a best buddy. It just can't be our enemy. And this is something the West is not willing to accept because it doesn't fit into that framework of us or them.
Exactly. And remember, before 2014, nobody was talking about doing this to Ukraine.
Nobody knew where Ukraine was.
In other words, back to your point, there was no necessity for it. In other words, Ukraine could have survived as an intact 50 million people nation in Europe, whose economy is one of the most, could have been one of the richest countries in Europe. It's got enormous leftover Soviet sort of industrial complex, economic complex that could have been reworked and remodeled and remodified to fit the modernity, the modern economic development of today's West, but no. So in other words, the point being, yeah, there was no need or necessity or some sort of a strategic threat emanating out of Moscow that was uh, going to sort of present an existential threat to America's allies, the European continent, or Washington. That's why I said this is what happened in the peacetime, and that's what's ironic and that's what's tragic about it. Look, we can all say, on the other hand, we can say, no, there was peacetime before World War I or before World War II, right? For example, there is no guarantees what people will do or leaders will do. They can rationalize themselves into disasters, if you will. If we go with the thesis that states are rational, sure they are, but they can also rationalize themselves into disasters, and we got World War II out of it, two world wars out of it on the European continent. So yeah, yes, to a large extent, perhaps the world is condemned to tragedy and wars and mayhem. But I just in the post-Cold War era, in the post-Soviet Union era, when sort of this America, the benevolent power, was supposed to come up with a better plan, better vision. Well, those things only turned out to be better on paper because, as it turns out, they had, very malignant sort of intentions, malign intentions against anyone. And then we know, looking back at America's history, just this is the country that cannot tolerate, cannot stand a potential rise of any hegemon. But forget hegemony. This was just also a visceral hatred of Moscow, of Russia. Perhaps even, I don't want to be all sort of ethno-racist here, but even against, it was a hatred of the Slavic world, perhaps. And that has precedent in history. This is not something that just it was a fear of another Soviet-style dictator taking over Kremlin after, say, the two idiots, Gorbachev and Yeltsin. But it had nothing of, if anything, it had very little to do with the fear that Russia was going to rise up again and present a Soviet-type strategic threat. Anne-Marie Sarotti has written an excellent book about it, Not 1 Inch, meaning not 1 inch eastward, the whole NATO expansion lie that was imposed on Russia. In it, you can tell that Russia was on her knees. Even the nuclear codes. There was a passage there by James Baker that he was in shock that Yeltsin was telling him how the nuclear codes, when during the first years of the collapse of the Soviet Union, how the nuclear codes were being very nonchalantly sort of circulating around. He was telling him that he would have to be the last person, if I recall correctly, after generals or his generals would bring him the briefcase. They would have to go through some protocols, of course, and James Baker is listening and recalling this in his memoir, saying that how shocked he was. This is how decrepit Russia had become. This is how disorganized and really prostituted Russia became after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where this drunken president is telling a former foe, strategic foe, the capitalist, and a nuclear enemy, how the nuclear codes are being organized in Moscow. And it's a fascinating read, but point being, Russia was nowhere near presenting of the threat that it had when it was the Soviet Union. And yet, right from the get-go, shortly after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Washington's hawks immediately, both liberal and conservative. It doesn't really matter. They were already worried about how to keep Russia down. And this entire programs of it was just an insult to Russia, that the whole NATO expansion, or when Russia was asking for membership in NATO, they provided some sort of a marginal program. I think it was George Shalikashvili, the ethnically Georgian general, that proposed that program of NATO, sort of a bridge before Russia would be considered as a full member of NATO. There was a program, I forgot the name of it now.
Well, the Partnership for Peace and the
correct, and Russia would have to participate. It was a spit in the face. That program meant really it was nothing.
Although no, I don't completely agree. The Partnership for Peace is an interesting example, I think, for how something that has a very strong and straightforward also peace rationale can be turned around and converted into its opposite. I mean, it's very interesting. You've got behind you the latest book by Jack Matlock, right? And Jack Matlock, the last ambassador to the Soviet Union, who's now 95, and that little book he wrote, that of being now already halfway through of his 90s, is a lovely read. He is one of the architects of the post-Cold War. And he keeps emphasizing, look, the Cold War ended not because the Soviet Union lost, it ended because we both negotiated it to an end. The Cold War ended in 1989 when we said we're going to end it, and then the Soviet Union collapsed 2 years later for related but different reasons. And he's one of the people who was lobbying in Washington, also in the 90s, to not antagonize Russia and to build common vessels, right? And to allow Russia to join the institutions of the West, right? And there was the idea of having Russia join even NATO, and the Partnership for Peace was at least from his side, from the dovish side, the pro-peace faction of the United States, meant to become an institution where you can exchange, trust building, and so on, and integration, and in the end, then build something also. The different legs, the OSCE would be one, and then NATO and Partnership for Peace would be another one, common building. But at the same time, you had the neocons and the hawks who said, like, no, being on your knees is not deep enough. You have to be shattered. And unfortunately, it's that wing that won out. That's why also you had Matlock fighting these people officially, like testifying in Congress, right, saying NATO expansion is a bad idea. Don't do it. The Clinton went ahead anyway, right? And so I do think that there's a bit of a contest, but it is true that in the end it became this vessel in order to antagonize Russia. And the Partnership for Peace, of course, with Russia died. I mean, there was the NATO-Russia Council became completely dysfunctional because it can't. It became an anti-Russian alliance, and this is kind of the tragedy. Why it is that the people like him and like Jeffrey Sachs, who told us, like, look, I created a plan to rescue the Polish economy. That was implemented. I created a plan to rescue the Russian economy. They laughed me out of the room. Why it is that you can't, that this alternative reality didn't become a reality, although we've seen it. It was in front of us, right?
I absolutely agree with you on that point about Jack Matlock. Sure, there are some. It's undeniable that the intention was there. There was something fresh was starting, right? Russia was coming out of this Soviet past, and well-intended folks in Washington, I'm confident, and we have documents to prove that they did want to work with Russia. But then, sort of, I would say, characteristic to Western hypocrisy or propaganda, that good intention started to, remember when Zelensky said, look, we don't want any problems with Putin, when he was fresh into the presidency.
Yeah.
And they were saying, oh, sure, yeah, no problem. But then, I don't know, 48 hours later, I'm just saying rhetorically speaking, a phone call comes in and says, don't you dare, right? It was a peacetime. Everything was fine. Zelensky didn't come didn't wake up and say, you know what, I'm president of Ukraine now. I know America will protect me, so I'm going to go antagonize Russia. After Yanukovych, when he came into power, he actually wanted peace with Russia. And so, yeah, I mean, the intention, and even today, there are some people who think that, look, they can spread democracy all over the world and the world will be sort of the democratic peace theory. There's a well-intentioned folks out there, I'm sure. Um, and so, and I think Jack Medlock, one of the greatest still living legends, if you ask me, is one of those folks, one of those people. And I had the honor of hosting him in Tbilisi for the forum. But then somehow things always go grotesquely wrong. Something happens
Yeah,
where, yeah,
it,
the idea
it
of take over.
and sorry, this is just something we need to, I mean, really put our finger on, because on the one hand, we have these people like Matlock, like Sachs, and realists like Mearsheimer, although Mearsheimer wasn't that close in the policymaking process, Sachs and Matlock were. And then you've got the narrative, right? And the narrative that this is all a benevolent attempt at implementing freedom, at defending freedom, that narrative persists. The myth kind of persists as a layer, as a thick, greasy layer on top of the ugly soup of truth beneath it, which is that it is a hegemonic project. But not everybody wants that, right? And so the question is, why is it that ugly soup always kind of wins out? Um, and that myth layer then swims on top so comfortably. And even now, I mean, a majority of people in Europe and the United States believe that Ukraine is defending the freedom of the free world, which is insane, but they do believe it.
Yes, and I think this is when we can answer those questions by basically using, the theories that we have in the field. That's where the tragedy lies. I think there is an obsession, rightly and wrongly, that either there cannot be a geopolitical military hierarchy facing the United States. It will always be considered a potential enemy, and why not try to nip it in the bud, especially when the U.S. loses very little, if anything, vis-a-vis Georgia, Ukraine. Right? China is a different matter altogether, right? China is something that is, that truly presents. Although Jeffrey Sachs probably wouldn't agree with us on this. He's famous for disagreeing with Professor Mearsheimer on this point. But rise of China, yes, okay, it's plausible. The logic suggests that it can turn into an aggressive sort of regional hegemon. Looking at the entire international system from the point of view where you don't pick and choose strategically your vital national security interests, inevitably will bring you to where we are now in terms of the collective West situation vis-a-vis facing Russia and their embarrassment in which they find themselves. But just very briefly, I wanted to mention, if you recall, Andrei Kozyrev, he was a young idealist, pro-Western foreign policy chief under Gorbachev, and that's when the Soviet Union broke up and everybody was happy in Washington, didn't know what to do with themselves. They invite Kozyrev to France, Paris, and he was. I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but the gist of his the recollection of what happened was that he was being completely ignored by Western and French diplomats. The idea being, and the implication being, that he simply did not matter anymore, even though the collapse of the Soviet Union sort of was met with this, fanfare and looking for roles for the new role for the Russian Federation to participate and become a civilized a part of the civilized West, that had disappeared. And so few years into into Gorbachev and Andrei Kozyrev's administration, he was saying how he was being toyed with because it had already been lost. The cause was lost. And he understood right there and then that such sort of really insulting treatment by some of the Western diplomats. I think he was left in a restaurant or something. Don't quote me on that, but there was a situation where they just left him wait. It was just basically spit in the face by Western politicians and diplomats, indicating that Russia simply didn't matter anymore, and that it had to be a junior partner of Washington if it wanted to even have a chance chance for being a functional state within the sort of Western unipolar world. So that's that's sort of part of this whole myth breaking and myth shattering, where it took 30 plus years for all this to be revealed. And the signs of it, I would argue, started to be revealed in 2008. And the craziness of support of the Saakashvili's regime and then propping him up as some sort of future generation of young reformers that were going to carry the torch of the liberal democracy promotion agenda. All of that turned out to be, because again, remember, the key point is there was no plan for nation building. This is where Georgians, Ukrainians perhaps get confused about. There was no post-World War II type nation building program. This was just, let's toy with these minions. Let's toy in the South Caucasus. Let's look at some history books. Let's see how the British had conducted business in the South Caucasus and why, and maybe get some clues from that. And no Western power had ever bothered to go into the South Caucasus and modernize the region or build modern states out of that geopolitical space, right? And so why should we do it now? Except, guess what? This geopolitical space does offer some sort of a springboard against Russia, where we can launch either, some sort of a propaganda, a war against Russia. We can excite these small states that don't know any better, promise them freedom, some sort of a potential membership in the elite security and economic clubs in the Anglo-Saxon world. And if we get them so excited that they will go and fight with Russia, why not? This is really as cynical as I'm portraying it to be. I don't see any other way. There was nothing else behind it. Those programs, one could argue, America has spent millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, so just say on Georgia, to prop it up, to modernize it. Yeah, there were some reforms, sure, under Saakashvili, as I keep mentioning, but nothing near to what it actually takes to modernize a developing state. And we also know what the United States did with Japan after it immediately found out that the Meiji Restoration, for example, there were signs that it was going to be an enormously powerful state. Well, the West starts to go against it. It's Japan, I think, it still cannot get over the idea that the West did not accept it, even though it's an Asian country and it wanted the West so badly that it went through all these reforms. And you probably know this, you can speak of this better than I do. But then America sort of pushes it back and says, hey, wait a minute, if we prop you up to the point where you're going to become second China, what good are you? So this is kind of a cynical approach where we can give you, we're going to keep you on the leash, basically. Nowhere near Georgia or Ukraine were part of that leash. One would say, at least give us that leash where you could develop, you can modernize us to a point where you can say, hey guys, you become so rich that wait a minute now, we don't want you to become another, great regional power. But Georgia was not even in the vicinity of being considered of being considered as a country who would be sort of a candidate for that program.
No, but I mean, these countries are looked at not as how do we make them better. They're being looked at as how can we use them, right? How can we make the most for us out of what we find over there? And Georgia was always this very convenient little thorn in the side of Russia, right? Where you can like distract it a lot. And let's be honest, I mean, the Caucasus, for Russia, the North Caucasus is a region that is unstable, right? I mean that is potentially dangerous to the rest, right? And the South Caucasus, the nations there are something that can be very straightforwardly used, and we are seeing that right now. Georgia, we're saying so for the last 2 years, is the one that got away, but the one that didn't get away apparently is Armenia. And we're seeing the dismantling of Armenia in front of our eyes, right? And how the Western process is fueling the politics and policies in Armenia that, well, I mean, if it doesn't improve, this might lead to the end of the state. The Armenia already lost very important parts of what it used to consider its state territory, and it's losing even more parts. It's losing the Zangezur corridor to the Americans. It's losing all of its bargaining power towards Turkey. I mean, it's under direct threat still of Azerbaijan, and the West is applauding this, saying like, go for it, because we can implement our designs over there. So it's not stopping this process of trying to abuse, well, whatever geopolitics has around.
Well, 2 points on that. First, ironically, you can tell that without the West, without America, the region is doing, relatively speaking, just fine. Georgia has been experiencing almost 7 to 9% economic growth. It's found itself, trading with regional powers, with Russia, of course, and so there was peace and stability in this very strange peace and stability that has set in Georgia. So, point being, the Washington's politics sort of, if successfully kept away or out of the region, it seems to me that the draconian evil Russia can also act very rationally. That Russia does not wake up one day and say, out of the blue, that let me just invade this tiny country, Georgia, and see if we can, get additional headaches in the South Caucasus, in addition to what we've gotten ourselves into Ukraine, with Ukraine, even though obviously Russia is winning and all that. But in other words, the Kremlin operatives are rational operatives unless they see a fundamental threat. Again, NATO, which prior to 2008, it was being presented as a potential, or as the organization that was going to enter the South Caucasus. Russia isn't looking forward to starting trouble. It has done plenty of damage in the early 90s, but there was always a reason. I'm not justifying it, I'm not defending it, but if you look at Russia's foreign policy in the region, it's hard to argue that it's been irrational. Have there been mistakes made? Sure, but what do we know when we study this field is that great powers are extremely sensitive. So they will go to great lengths, as Mearsheimer says, to protect themselves. However messy that might turn out to be, Russia will act, and it has acted.
But they're not idiots. And I must say, like, because the stupid thing to me, or the insulting thing to me, is that people in the West pretend that Russia does what it does because it hates democracies and it hates freedom. It's like, no, it couldn't care less. Just look at Mongolia. It's a beautiful
myth, right?
Beautiful democracy in sandwiched between two large, let's say, autocratic states, and neither of them gives a damn, because this little democracy plays along. It's not a threat to either of them. It actually is quite a useful one in between them, and that serves both of them perfectly fine, and they leave it alone. The local process is not being systematically undermined. So this obsession of the West with thinking that because they try to interfere everywhere. Therefore, the others will also try to interfere because, and then we just slap stupid attributes on them. That's the insulting part to me, or the myth.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. The second point, real quick, Pascal, was that if this trip program under President Trump that's supposed to manage the Zangezur corridor, right? Well, you can see what we've been saying, that, look, if you come into the South Caucasus, let's just say through peaceful geoeconomic projects, nobody minds. I don't think Russia, well, sure, Russia's influence in relative terms might have declined, but not in security, not what matters the most. In that area, it hasn't declined. Russia has rebuilt its war economy vis-a-vis, because of Ukraine. And who in their right mind now think that Russia is weaker now than it was, say, before 2014? Russia's strength started to appear when it preserved, or when it called, one of the first signs of the Western myth in 2014 when the coup happened. So, so the idea that Russia is losing the South Caucasus is another hysteria. This is another sort of endless hysteria of Russia is not losing it, as the South Caucasus, and Russia will perhaps acquiesce, most likely, to say Trump coming in, managing the Zangezur corridor, and engage. Now, if it starts to militarize, if they start to marginalize and directly go against Iran, Russia's ally in the region, right? Then we'll see things, of course, starting to reach the boiling point again. We'll get back to square one. But the idea that just because with Turkish help, Azerbaijan is becoming a regional power, or regional hegemon, or that Russia is losing out on South Caucasus, I think it's a laughable logic. It's not even logical. It's just, it doesn't fit the reality. Nobody has ever qualified when they say this. I hear this on YouTube and on social media. Oh, Russia is losing influence, and then some serious people out there obviously are just disagreeing with it. But nobody has ever qualified why. Do you think it's enough to say that because, say, Baku, with its smart strategy, allied itself with Turkey, took back Nagorno-Karabakh, and now we're thinking what? That it's going to challenge Russia? In fact, there are plenty of articles in the literature that exist that says how careful Aliyev has been, even after the tragic incident, for which, by the way, I thought Putin did not, but he did apologize when they met on October 9th, I think it was. When
the downing of the airplane, yeah.
Correct, for the downing of the airplane. But so before it was, oh, Putin is humiliated, and Azerbaijan and Armenia are winning the day, and France is got. Yeah, Putin is a grand strategist. He's just look at the dynamics of how they've handled Marco Rubio's situation when this whole meeting got canceled, and now they're in Budapest. Hopefully, they will get this meeting going. But yes, those who are in the mental camp of saying Russia is nothing but a giant gas station continue to ridicule Putin, right? And yet it comes out almost every step of the way that Putin is perhaps one step ahead, strategically speaking, ahead of the West. Not to mention Europe. Europe is lost cause. I mean, they're like psychotic children, if you ask me. They don't know what to do themselves.
Lasha, this is not fair towards psychotic children.
Oh, yes. So thank you. Yeah, this is not a good way, not a good idea. Analogy. I apologize. Yeah.
Because Europeans are way beyond that. So.
They're just running around like crazy children. I don't know what to say. They're lost. But even with Trump now, and with Marco Rubio, they have shown that. Marco Rubio's worldview has to reckon with harsh reality that Russia has its fundamental security interests.
Yeah.
And those root causes that Putin calls root causes cannot be reneged. He cannot go back on those.
No.
And that realization that apparently great powers care for their security and prestige is what's driving, I think, folks like Rubio in Washington crazy or irritates them. And so, of course, if we take all this together, we see how difficult it has turned out to be for the Trump administration to come up with this solution, because the only solution now is the winner takes it.
Yeah. Although what is not settled to my mind is whether the solution is actually something that's being sought or not, because we still have the argument of Brian Berletic that stands, I think, very strong that, continuity of agenda is a given fact, and we just see we see difference in approaches, but we don't see a change in strategy. But this is something we need to discuss the next time, because unfortunately today we have a hard stop. Lasha, people who want to read from you or see more from you, where should they go?
Well, the Realist Review, Acura, the National Interest, and of course on the Neutrality Channel, I have a few pieces there. Thanks to you.
I'll put them into the description below. Lasha Kasradze, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Pascal. It was great.